Hello, I'm Lauren from the Student Learning Support Service. Today we are going to talk about adverbial clauses. Okay, let's start with a quick recap. Hopefully you have already watched the video on complex sentences, those sentences where we are joining an independent clause and a dependent or more than one dependent clause together. I showed you that they can be joined by subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns. And now we're going to extend this to talk about different types of dependent clauses. So this video is specifically about adverbial clauses, but there are other videos on relative clauses and noun clauses which are just as important. So make sure you check out those once you're done here. So let's start with subordinate conjunctions. Remember those from complex sentences? These are those words like because, if, although, while, until, and though. There's a huge list of these, so don't panic that you have to memorize them all. These are just a few examples. Now, while the relative and noun clauses both modify something in the sentence, that means they change it in order to help our understanding of it, the adverbial clause uses a subordinate conjunction to show a relationship between the two clauses. For example, I will finish my readings tonight because I have class in the morning. In this way, an adverbial clause plays the role of an adverb. It adds extra explanatory detail to our sentence to help explain how or why something happened. Take, for example, he ran slowly. The adverb slowly tells me how he ran. If I was instead to say he ran until he couldn't run anymore, the clause until he couldn't run anymore is also telling me how he ran. Additionally, it tells me that how he ran is related to time, until a point at which he couldn't run anymore. He probably got a stitch or ran out of breath. And there are lots of relationships that adverbial clauses describe. They show us a causal relationship or the reason for something. We use words like because or since. They show us a contrast with words like while or although. They show us conditional relationships with if or as long as. They show us time relationships with until or when or while. They show us purpose with so or that or and they can show us a comparison with as or than. So let's take a closer look at each of these. So the first main reason we use an adverbial clause is to show a reason or cause for something. These help us understand why something is the case. The easiest version of this is to add the subordinating conjunction because or since. The slimming drug was withdrawn because of serious long-term side effects. In academic writing, though, it can often sound more formal to use since or as instead of because, especially at the beginning of a sentence. So instead I might say, since the slimming drug had serious long-term side effects, it was withdrawn. And remember, we can also change the position of our adverbial clause. The slimming drug was removed as it had serious long-term side effects. The second really important type of adverbial clause is that which shows contrast or concession. And these are really useful in academic writing as they show us that two points are in opposition to each other. And they use subordinating conjunctions like though, even though, although, while, whereas, and even if. So although some historians regard it as a great success, others point to its faults. These are particularly useful because they limit the power of generalizations in our writing. Basically, they allow you to limit the scope of what you're discussing and account for opposing points of view. So even though it is a key part of British society, the welfare state has been criticised by many. And they can do both of these things, both limit our generalizations and account for opposing points of view in a very succinct way, which makes them very useful in places like introductions, in thesis statements, and in topic sentences. The next really important adverbial clause for our academic writing is a conditional clause. If the adverbial clause is used to show a condition, we can use if, unless, or then. See what I did there? That was an adverbial clause. A conditional clause is used to show the condition or situation that must exist for the main idea of the sentence to come into effect. So if you practice lots, your grammar will improve. Your grammar will only improve, that statement will only be true if the other condition is met, which is that you will practice. And this is another very useful adverbial clause in our academic writing, particularly when we want to show a position or an argument. Adverbial clauses of time show us when or how often something happens. And these are made up of subordinating conjunctions such as after, as long as, before, since, as soon as, until, while, when, or no sooner than. For example, once the study was concluded, the authors wrote their conclusions. Or we won't know the results until we run the test. Adverbial clauses can also demonstrate purpose, so why something happens. To do this, we use words like so, in order to, or in order that. So the authors removed the patients' names from the report in order to protect their confidentiality. Or so you don't ruin the carpet, please take off your shoes. And finally, we can also use adverbial clauses to offer a comparison by using conjunctions such as, or so as, or than. I'll show you what I mean by that. So she is not as smart as she thinks, or he is bigger than his friend. I know these don't necessarily sound like they might be their own separate adverbial clause, but they are. They are acting in that adverbial way in that they are describing the how or the why of something. So the position of adverbial clauses doesn't really matter so long as the relationship between the two clauses is clear. That is the most important part of our adverbial clauses, that relationship. So when I use it in front of the sentence, I use a comma to separate the two clauses. When I use it at the end, though, I don't actually need a comma in most cases. However, if I add additional information that might confuse that relationship between the two clauses, then I do really need to think about which order is best to put my clauses in. And this is especially so because we can add more than one dependent clause or more than one adverbial clause to a sentence. For example, since the slimming drug had serious long-term side effects, although it had promising results, it was withdrawn. Now, something doesn't quite work in this sentence, does it? The reason is that I've added this extra adverbial clause, although it had promising results. But now the first adverbial clause, since the slimming drug has serious long-term side effects, is too far removed from the reason why it was removed. Because remember that first clause, since is showing us the reason or the cause for it being removed. So really for this sentence to make sense, I want to keep these two clauses closer together. So I might restructure my sentence to read, although the slimming drug had promising results, it was removed because it had long-term side effects. Remember, we can build our adverbial clauses together to create quite long and detailed sentences. It doesn't always mean that we should, but we can. And sometimes you'll see these kinds of sentences that are made up of multiple different clauses, including more than one adverbial clause in a lot of academic writing. For example, while they were studying, they paused for a coffee break because they were tired. And the more familiar you become with not just adverbial clauses, but relative clauses and noun clauses as well, the easier it will be to spot them in the writing of others. And if you can spot them, you can figure out what the main independent clause is. And this often helps us when we're feeling like we're struggling to really figure out what the purpose of that sentence is, like what is the author trying to tell us. Sometimes we get the adverbial clauses confused for being the main point, and they're usually not. So learning how to see them will help you to be able to read and understand the writing of others better. And of course, it will improve your own writing because you will be able to construct better sentences that show the kinds of relationships between clauses and between ideas and information that we need to show in our academic writing. Adverbial clauses allow us to add a lot of important information to our writing, and really importantly, they help us demonstrate those relationships between ideas. Causal, contrasting, and conditional adverbial clauses in particular are going to be very useful in your academic writing. So, where to from here? If you haven't already, make sure you watch the video on complex sentences, on relative clauses, and on noun clauses. That's it from me. I'll see you next time.